In the heart of the sprawling Roman Empire, a man sat on a marble throne, carved with symbols of power and wisdom. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, Emperor of Rome, was no ordinary ruler. Unlike many before him, his mind was steeped not only in the politics of war and empire, but also in philosophy, the search for meaning beyond conquest and gold. His rule, marked by the clash of steel and the quiet reflection of a scholar, was about to be tested like never before. Born in 121 AD, Marcus had grown up amidst privilege, yet he was no mere spoiled noble. From an early age, his education was rigorous, focused on the teachings of Stoicism, a philosophy that preached resilience, virtue, and control over one's inner world regardless of external chaos. He absorbed the lessons of Seneca, Epictetus, and other great thinkers, carving out in his mind a fortress of reason in a world ruled often by passion and greed. Now, as emperor, he bore the weight of the empire on his shoulders, a vast territory stretching from the windswept highlands of Britannia to the sun-drenched sands of Egypt. But even as Rome's legions marched across borders, defending its might, Marcus knew that the greatest battles were not always fought on the battlefield. In the marble halls of the imperial palace in Rome, the air hung heavy with the scent of incense and heated debate. Senators argued politics while courtiers whispered secrets and lies. Marcus sat silently, his pale eyes scanning the room, listening carefully. He was a man of action, but also of thought. His reign would be remembered not only for the wars waged, but for the ideas he left behind. His personal journal, which he called Meditations, was a private record of his thoughts, and struck us a window into the soul of a man trying to remain just and humble while wielding absolute power. Yet peace was fragile. To the north, barbarian tribes stirred, restless under Rome's shadow. To the east, the Parthian Empire eyed Roman lands with envy. Within the empire, the plague loomed like a silent ghost, threatening to unravel the delicate fabric of society. Marcus knew that the challenges ahead would test every ounce of his philosophy and strength. One early morning, as dawn's first light crept through the golden curtains of his chambers, a messenger arrived, breathless and pale. Word had come from the Danube frontier. A brutal uprising among the Marcomanni tribe threatened to spill into Roman territory. The legions stationed there were outnumbered, and a swift response was needed. Marcus rose from his seat, the weight of destiny settling firmly on his broad shoulders. This was no longer a matter of philosophy alone, it was a call to arms. "Prepare my horse," he commanded, his voice steady. "I will lead the legions myself." The courtiers gasped. It was rare for emperors to leave the comfort of Rome, marble and velvet, for the hardships of the northern frontiers. But Marcus was no ordinary ruler. He believed that a leader must stand with his people in times of trial, not hide behind walls. As he rode through the cobbled streets, citizens gathered, murmuring prayers and hopes. The philosopher emperor was leaving to face the unknown. The journey north was arduous. The roads turned from polished stone to muddy paths swallowed by dense forests. The cold bit into the flesh, and whispers of war haunted every step. Marcus rode alongside his generals, listening intently to reports, offering wisdom forged in thought as sharp as any sword. In the war camps, he did not sit idly on a throne, but shared the soldiers' hardships, sleeping on straw mats and eating the same simple rations. His presence lifted the spirits of men hardened by years of battle. They saw in him not just a ruler, but a fellow warrior. Yet war was a harsh tutor. The Marcomanni proved fierce, their attacks swift and relentless. Marcus understood. The frozen winds of the Danube River howled like restless spirits across the vast frontier where the Roman legions stood guard. Marcus Aurelius, now far from the marble halls of Rome, felt the bitter cold biting through his cloak, a harsh reminder that this was a world very different from the grandeur of the city. The northern borders were not just geographical lines. They were the thin edge of civilization, a constant battleground between order and chaos, Rome and the tribes beyond. Marcus had arrived weeks earlier, his presence alone shifting the mood of the encampment. The soldiers, grizzled veterans, hardened by years of conflict, found in him something unexpected, a leader who not only commanded with authority, but who understood their fears, their hopes, and their exhaustion. They called him the philosopher, emperor, a nickname earned not just from his Stoic writings, but from his calm presence amid turmoil. The Marcomanni, a fierce Germanic tribe, had been pressing hard against Rome's northern borders, emboldened by weakness and unrest. They were not mere barbarians. They were survivors fighting for their land, their families, and their way of life. Marcus respected them, understanding the complexity of this conflict. War was never simple, and he knew Rome's expansion came with consequences. The first weeks of the campaign were brutal. Dense forests hid enemy scouts in sudden raids. Roman soldiers marched through muddy trails, often ambushed by swift and cunning foes. The emperor, though not a soldier by training alone, adapted quickly, absorbing lessons on guerrilla tactics and the harsh realities of frontier warfare. Marcus made a point to visit the wounded and the weary. In the dim light of the field hospital, he sat with men who had lost limbs or brothers in battle. His presence was a balm, a reminder that even an emperor was not immune to suffering. "Endure," he told them quietly, "for pain is fleeting, but honor lasts." Yet the pressures of command weighed heavily on him. Each decision could mean life or death for thousands. The burden was immense, but Marcus found strength in his philosophy. Stoicism taught him that while he could not control external events, he could master his responses. "It is not what happens to you," he reminded himself, "but how you react that matters." As the days passed, Marcus orchestrated a series of tactical strikes, designed not to annihilate the Marcomanni, but to push them back and secure the frontier. He sent emissaries to negotiate peace, offering terms that respected the tribe's dignity while safeguarding Rome's interests. This blend of strength and diplomacy was unusual for an emperor, and some generals doubted his approach. One afternoon, a council of war gathered in a tent heavy with smoke and tension. Generals argued fiercely for harsher measures, for crushing the tribes with overwhelming force. Marcus listened patiently before speaking, his voice steady but resolute. "We fight not for conquest alone," he said, "but for peace and stability. To win by force is to invite endless war. To win by wisdom is to secure lasting peace." His words carried weight, but the generals were skeptical. War hardened men's hearts, and Marcus knew that to some, his philosophy seemed like weakness. Yet he stood firm, aware that leadership required more than brute power, it demanded vision. Meanwhile, the plague ravaged the Roman cities behind him. Letters arrived describing deserted streets, grieving families, and a population struck down by an invisible enemy. Marcus's thoughts often drifted back to Rome, to his wife Faustina and their children, to the empire he loved but feared might crumble. In private moments, he wrote in his meditations reflections on fate and mortality. "What is life but a fleeting breath?" he asked himself. "All things are ephemeral. To live well is to accept death as part of the journey." His writings revealed a man wrestling with his humanity. The crown was heavy, the empire vast and vulnerable, and the future uncertain. Yet Marcus did not succumb to despair. Instead, he embraced the Stoic ideal of endurance, of meeting adversity with calm and courage. The war with the Marcomanni dragged on for years, a relentless trial of wills. Marcus's leadership inspired loyalty and resilience. His soldiers fought not just for land, but for the principles their emperor embodied: duty, honor, and wisdom. One bitter winter night, as snow blanketed the camp, a scout returned with urgent news. A massive force of enemy tribes, the winter snows of the northern frontier, had barely melted when Marcus Aurelius turned his gaze back toward Rome. The northern campaign had ended in a tense but hard-earned peace with the Marcomanni. The frontiers were secure for now, but the empire was far from safe. As his caravan wound its way south along the ancient roads of Italy, the emperor could feel the tension in the air. Villages along the route greeted him warmly, yet behind the smiles there was fear. The Antonine Plague, an invisible killer, still stalked the empire. It had started years earlier during the Parthian campaigns, carried westward by soldiers and merchants. By now, it had sunk its claws deep into every corner of Roman life. Rome's great cities, once bursting with life, had grown quieter. Markets still bustled, but with fewer traders. Theaters staged plays, but their benches were half empty. Marcus knew that behind closed doors, families mourned in silence. When he entered Rome's gates, the sight was sobering. The forum, usually alive with chatter and commerce, felt muted. The air carried a faint scent of incense from the countless funeral rites. Citizens knelt as he passed, not in mere ceremony, but in hope that their emperor could somehow turn the tide. Inside the marble walls of the imperial palace, the Senate awaited. The Curia Julia's towering columns framed the chamber where the empire's most powerful men gathered. As Marcus entered, their eyes followed him, some filled with respect, others with suspicion. The senior senator, Cassius Longinus, rose to speak. "Caesar," he began, "your victories on the frontier bring honor to Rome, yet within our own borders, the pestilence spreads unchecked. Grain shipments falter, tax revenues shrink, and unrest stirs among the provinces. We must act." Marcus listened, his face unreadable. The plague could not be fought with swords. It was an enemy that struck without warning, without mercy, killing senators and slaves alike. "We will act," Marcus said at last, his voice calm but firm. "We will secure food for the cities, protect the provinces from exploitation, and strengthen the treasury. But above all, we will not allow fear to rule us. Fear is a greater enemy than the plague itself," the Senate murmured, some in agreement, others skeptical. Marcus's approach, measured, philosophical, was not the usual Roman answer to crisis. Rome's elite often preferred swift, ruthless solutions. That night, in the quiet of his study, Marcus wrote in his meditations, "You may leave this life at any moment. Let that determine what you do and say and think." His quill scratched steadily across the parchment. These writings were never meant for the public. They were his way of holding fast to reason when the world seemed determined to tear it away. In the weeks that followed, Marcus threw himself into the work of rebuilding. He ordered grain from Africa to feed the hungry, restructured taxes to ease the burden on plague-stricken regions, and sent doctors what few there were to the worst-hit provinces. But the empire was vast, and the emperor's reach was not infinite. In Egypt, the grain fleets were threatened by piracy. In the east, whispers of Parthian resurgence grew louder. And in the Senate, political rivalry simmered. It was during this fragile time that a troubling message arrived. Avidius Cassius, one of Rome's most celebrated generals and governor of Syria, was rumored to be amassing power beyond what his post required. Cassius was a man of ambition, respected for his military brilliance, but known for his pride. Marcus considered the possibility that Cassius might seek the purple himself. If such a rebellion broke out, it could fracture the empire when it was least able to endure division. Yet instead of ordering immediate arrest or assassination common Roman responses, Marcus chose patience. He knew Cassius was a man who believed in his own destiny. Such men were dangerous, but they could also be reasoned with, if approached wisely. Meanwhile, the plague crept closer to the palace walls. Servants fell ill, and the imperial household held daily prayers to the gods. Marcus did not hide from the danger, visited the sick, offered comfort, and even joined public ceremonies to reassure the people. One evening, as the sun set over the Tiber, the winter snows of the northern frontier had barely melted, when Marcus Aurelius turned his gaze back toward Rome. The northern campaign had ended in a tense but hard-earned peace with the Marcomanni. The frontiers were secure for now, but the empire was far from safe. As his caravan wound its way south along the ancient roads of Italy, the emperor could feel the tension in the air. Villages along the route greeted him warmly, yet behind the smiles there was fear. The Antonine Plague, an invisible killer, still stalked the empire. It had started years earlier during the Parthian campaigns, carried westward by soldiers and merchants. By now, it had sunk its claws deep into every corner of Roman life. Rome's great cities, once bursting with life, had grown quieter. Markets still bustled, but with fewer traders. Theaters staged plays, but their benches were half empty. Marcus knew that behind closed doors, families mourned in silence. When he entered Rome's gates, the sight was sobering. The forum, usually alive with chatter and commerce, felt muted. The air carried a faint scent of incense from the countless funeral rites. Citizens knelt as he passed, not in mere ceremony, but in hope that their emperor could somehow turn the tide. Inside the marble walls of the imperial palace, the Senate awaited. The Curia Julia's towering columns framed the chamber where the empire's most powerful men gathered. As Marcus entered, their eyes followed him, some filled with respect, others with suspicion. The senior senator, Cassius Longinus, rose to speak. "Caesar," he began, "your victories on the frontier bring honor to Rome, yet within our own borders, the pestilence spreads unchecked. Grain shipments falter, tax revenues shrink, and unrest stirs among the provinces. We must act." Marcus listened, his face unreadable. The plague could not be fought with swords. It was an enemy that struck without warning, without mercy, killing senators and slaves alike. "We will act," Marcus said at last, his voice calm but firm. "We will secure food for the cities, protect the provinces from exploitation, and strengthen the treasury. But above all, we will not allow fear to rule us. Fear is a greater enemy than the plague itself," the Senate murmured, some in agreement, others skeptical. Marcus's approach, measured, philosophical, was not the usual Roman answer to crisis. Rome's elite often preferred swift, ruthless solutions. That night, in the quiet of his study, Marcus wrote in his meditations, "You may leave this life at any moment. Let that determine what you do and say and think." His quill scratched steadily across the parchment. These writings were never meant for the public. They were his way of holding fast to reason when the world seemed determined to tear it away. In the weeks that followed, Marcus threw himself into the work of rebuilding. He ordered grain from Africa to feed the hungry, restructured taxes to ease the burden on plague-stricken regions, and sent doctors what few there were to the worst-hit provinces. But the empire was vast, and the emperor's reach was not infinite. In Egypt, the grain fleets were threatened by piracy. In the east, whispers of Parthian resurgence grew louder. And in the Senate, political rivalry simmered. It was during this fragile time that a troubling message arrived. Avidius Cassius, one of Rome's most celebrated generals and governor of Syria, was rumored to be amassing power beyond what his post required. Cassius was a man of ambition, respected for his military brilliance, but known for his pride. Marcus considered the possibility that Cassius might seek the purple himself. If such a rebellion broke out, it could fracture the empire when it was least able to endure division. Yet instead of ordering immediate arrest or assassination common Roman responses, Marcus chose patience. He knew Cassius was a man who believed in his own destiny. Such men were dangerous, but they could also be reasoned with, if approached wisely. Meanwhile, the plague crept closer to the palace walls. Servants fell ill, and the imperial household held daily prayers to the gods. Marcus did not hide from the danger, visited the sick, offered comfort, and even joined public ceremonies to reassure the people. One evening, as the sun set over the Tiber, Marcus stood on a balcony overlooking the city. His friend and fellow philosopher, Junius Rusticus, joined him. "You bear the weight of the world, Caesar," Rusticus said softly. Marcus smiled faintly. "The weight is not mine alone, it is Rome's. I merely carry my share." Rusticus studied him. "And what of Cassius? If he moves against you, the burden will be heavier still." Marcus turned back to the city. "If Cassius believes himself more fit to rule, then let him try." The spring winds in Rome carried a deceptive warmth. Flowers bloomed in the Forum, the markets overflowed with goods from across the empire, and for a moment it seemed as though peace had taken root. But Marcus Aurelius knew better. The calm was only the brief breath before another storm. Reports from the northern provinces arrived like clockwork, each more troubling than the last. Scouts along the Danube and the Rhine wrote of renewed movement among the Germanic tribes. The Quadi and the Marcomanni, though weakened, were rebuilding their strength. Farther west, the Chatti and the Chatti tribes, from the misty lands beyond the Rhine, had begun to probe the frontiers. The war that Marcus had fought years earlier had not ended. It only paused. In the Curia Julia, the Senate debated endlessly over the cost of another northern campaign. Some argued that the empire's resources were too strained, that the plague had thinned the population and the treasury alike. Others insisted that if Rome did not act, the tribes would unite and strike with greater force. Marcus sat through the arguments with patient silence. When the last senator finished, he rose. "The frontier is Rome's skin. If it is pierced, the blood of the empire flows freely. We cannot wait for the blade to fall. We must meet it before it strikes." The Senate, though reluctant, approved his plan. Legions would be raised and sent north. This time Marcus intended to bring his son Commodus with him, not merely as a royal spectator, but to begin shaping him into the leader Rome would one day need. Commodus was 17, tall and broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of youth. He had been trained in arms since boyhood and could handle a sword with skill. But Marcus worried that his son's nature leaned toward luxury rather than discipline. The frontier, harsh and unyielding, would strip away those comforts. The imperial procession departed Rome to great fanfare. Citizens lined the streets, cheering as the emperor and his son rode side by side. Behind them marched the Praetorian Guard, their polished armor flashing in the sunlight. Beyond the gates, however, the road to the frontier grew rough, the towns smaller, the land wilder. As the army advanced north, Marcus used the journey to teach Commodus not just about military strategy, but about the burdens of leadership. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire, discussing philosophy, justice, and the nature of power. Strength, Marcus told him one night, is not in the sword alone, but in the hand that chooses when to draw it. A ruler must know when to fight and when to stay his blade. Commodus listened, nodding, but Marcus could not tell how deeply the lesson sank. By the time they reached the Danube, the legions stationed there had already begun skirmishes with the enemy. The tribes were testing Rome's defenses, launching raids against supply lines and small outposts. The legions responded with equal ferocity, but the fighting was costly. Marcus wasted no time. He reorganized the frontier defenses, fortified key positions, and began preparations for a major campaign into enemy territory. Commodus was assigned to ride with the cavalry on reconnaissance missions close enough to danger to feel the weight of war. But under the watchful eye of experienced commanders, the young prince took to the battlefield with enthusiasm, eager to prove himself. In one skirmish, his unit clashed with a band of Quadi warriors, and Commodus fought bravely, returning with the spoils of victory. The soldiers cheered him, calling him Imperator's son with pride. Marcus, however, was cautious. Courage was valuable, but reckless pride could be fatal. Do not mistake glory for virtue, he warned Commodus after the battle. A fool may earn cheers in the moment, but only wisdom earns respect that lasts. Weeks turned into months as the campaign deepened. The Roman army pushed into the forests beyond the Danube, burning enemy villages, capturing warriors, and forcing tribal leaders to sue for peace. Yet each victory seemed to bring new enemies to the field. The northern tribes were not a single nation, but a web of alliances and rivalries. Defeating one often drove another into the arms of Rome's foes. The year was 180 AD, and Emperor Lucius Varro's reign stood at a crossroads, teetering between glorious expansion and dangerous overreach. His legions, hardened by years of campaigning along the Danube, had returned to Rome in triumph, yet beneath the veneer of victory lurked a growing unease, as whispers of discontent began to seep through the marble corridors of the Senate and the bustling marketplaces of the city. Rome's people, always eager for spectacle, feasts, and the reassuring presence of a strong leader, had grown accustomed to the rhythm of conquest followed by celebration. But Varro sensed the undercurrents of something more ominous, a subtle shift in the loyalty of both his generals and the senatorial elite. While the Colosseum roared with the blood sport of gladiators and the circus, Maximus thundered with the pounding hooves of chariots. Emissaries from the eastern provinces arrived with troubling news. Parthia was stirring, and its ruler Artabanus IV had begun forging alliances with nomadic tribes from the Caspian steppes, threatening the fragile balance of power that had been secured through years of delicate diplomacy. Varro, aware that an open conflict with Parthia could stretch Rome's resources to their limits, convened his closest advisors in the Hall of Mirrors, a grand chamber within the Palatine Palace where polished bronze reflected the flickering light of oil lamps, casting the faces of his council into strange, distorted shapes. General Aelius Corvus, the stoic commander of the Praetorian Guard, urged immediate military action, insisting that a display of force on the eastern border would deter Parthian ambitions. But Senator Gaius Fabius, an old statesman with a mind like a steel trap, cautioned against rashness, advocating instead for covert manipulation of Parthia's internal politics. Varro, torn between the aggressive instincts of his youth and the tempered wisdom age had begun to bestow upon him, decided upon a third path, a calculated display of Rome's power, not through war, but through an unprecedented festival that would draw envoys, merchants, and dignitaries from across the known world, showcasing the empire's wealth, unity, and cultural supremacy. The preparations for the Festival of Eternal Rome began at once, with artisans working day and night to craft towering statues of Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, while engineers erected temporary amphitheaters, fountains, and pavilions along the forum. Exotic animals were brought in from African lions, elephants, leopards, and even a rare white rhinoceros, while acrobats, musicians, and actors rehearsed performances that would dazzle even the most jaded of foreign guests. Yet as the city hummed with anticipation, the darker machinery of politics ground on in the shadows. In the Subura district, a network of spies loyal to the Senator Cassius Marcellus, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, spread rumors that Varro's extravagant festival was nothing more than a desperate attempt to mask economic instability. And in dimly lit taverns, retired soldiers grumbled that their pensions were being spent on feasts for foreigners rather than on the men who had bled for Rome. Varro's personal life, too, became entangled in the web of political intrigue, for his daughter, Julia Vera, had secretly fallen in love with Marcus Flavius, a rising military tribune, whose family had once been disgraced by a failed rebellion against the empire. Their romance, conducted through stolen glances and whispered meetings in the gardens of the Aventine, threatened to scandalize the imperial family should it become known, and Varro, though a father torn by affection, knew that any perceived weakness in his household could be exploited by his enemies. As the festival approached, the emperor received a letter sealed with the insignia of Parthiancide. A thin sheet of parchment bore a message written in Greek: "Rome shines brightly, but even the brightest flame casts deep shadows. Beware the gathering wind." Varro, reading these words under the dim light of his private study, understood that the Parthian ruler was as much a master of psychological warfare as of armies. The day of the festival arrived, and Rome was transformed into a living tapestry of color. Music and spectacle silk banners of crimson and gold rippled in the breeze. The scent of roasting boar and spiced wine filled the air, and the laughter of children mingled with the shouts of vendors hawking their wares. Foreign dignitaries marveled at the grandeur of the city, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed that Varro's gamble had paid off. Yet in the midst of the celebrations, a sudden commotion erupted near the Temple of Saturn, where a veiled figure darted through the crowd, pursued by 2 Praetorian guards. The figure slipped into an alley and vanished, but not before tossing a small clay tablet onto the temple steps, when it was retrieved and brought to the emperor. It was found to bear a single chilling word scratched into its surface: treachery. In that instant, Varro knew that the games being played in Rome were more dangerous than any fought on distant battlefields, for here in the heart of the empire, the enemy was invisible, their weapons whispers and secrets, and the war for Rome's soul had only just begun. As dawn broke over the imperial palace, Emperor Lucius Septimus Varro stood upon the marble balcony overlooking the Forum Romanum, the air thick with the mingled scent of baked bread from the markets and the metallic temps of the Tiber's morning mist. It was in this quiet hour, before the bustle of merchants, senators, and petitioners filled the heart of Rome, that he often found his clearest thoughts. For the burdens of empire weighed heavily, and yet, in those fleeting instants between night and day, he could almost believe himself a free man again, not the ruler of the known world. But that illusion was broken swiftly this morning, for from the shadows of the colonnade emerged Senator Aulus Cassianus, a man whose thin, hawk-like features and ever-calculating eyes carried the reputation of a political survivor. A man whose loyalties bent like reeds in the Tiber wind. Imperator. Aulus began with a tone of urgency, masked as formality. News from Britannia: our garrison at Dava Victrix has been besieged. The tribes grow restless again, and the governor pleads for reinforcements. Lucius's brow furrowed, for the northern campaigns had drained the treasury. And though Britannia was a jewel in Rome's imperial crown, its upkeep was costly. Its soldiers worn from the damp and cold, and its local chieftains ever scheming. Still abandoning, it would signal weakness to every province, and weakness was a scent that drew rebellion as blood drew wolves. Summoning his advisors, Lucius entered the Aula Regia, the great hall whose coffered ceilings echoed with the whispers of centuries of rule, and laid out the situation before the council, On one side, the pragmatist men like Cassianus surged, pulling back to more defensible positions, conserving troops for threats nearer to the capital. On the other, the idealists and patriots insisted that Rome's honor demanded a decisive strike to crush the insurrection before it spread. The debate raged for hours, punctuated by the clink of goblets and the shuffling of parchment maps, till at last Lucius raised a hand for silence and declared that he himself would lead a limited but rapid campaign to restore order, an unusual decision for an emperor in his later years, but one that sent murmurs of approval and apprehension alike through the court. Preparations began at once. Armor was polished, supply lines plotted, and dispatches sent across the sea to muster the legions in Gaul. Before leaving, Lucius walked alone through the gardens of Sallus. Their once carefully tended hedges, now overgrown in places, a reminder of how even Rome's grandeur could fade without constant care. And there he encountered his old friend, Marcus Terentius Varro, a retired general whose counsel had guided him in youth. "You chase glory in the mists of the north," Marcus said, "but remember, Lucius, glory is fleeting, and the mists can swallow more than men. They take empires too." Still the emperor pressed on, boarding the trireme that would carry him across the channel, its oars cutting through the choppy waters like the steady heartbeat of Rome itself. The campaign that followed was swift, and brutal fortresses reclaimed. Tribal leaders captured or killed, their stone hill forts set ablaze against the gray skies, but it was not without cost. For the weather turned against them, and disease crept through the ranks. Yet the sight of the imperial banner raised again over Deva Victrix sent ripples of reassurance through the provinces. The message clear: Rome's will still reached the edge of the world. Upon his return to the capital, Lucius was met not with unbroken cheers, but with the murmurs of unrest. For in his absence, the Senate had grown bolder, and whispers of conspiracy curled through the marble corridors. Though the people hailed him as a hero, he could feel the undercurrents, shifting alliances forming in the shadows, hands clasped in secret pacts. And so as he stood once more on the balcony at dawn, the same city sprawled before him, he knew that the real battle was not fought on distant frontiers, but here in the heart of Rome, where daggers gleamed brighter than swords, and betrayal could be poured as easily as wine. The marble hall of the Roman Senate was colder than the winter air outside, its towering columns casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of ancient secrets and treacherous deals. Emperor Lucius Varro, seated upon the gilded curule chair at the hall's center, could feel every eye upon him, the weight of suspicion hanging heavier than the imperial cloak across his shoulders. For whispers of conspiracy had been growing like mold in the dark corners of Rome, and though his spies fed him fragments of information, names muttered in taverns, glances exchanged in villa gardens, no one dared to step forward with proof, leaving him to navigate a maze of half-truths and shadows. The senators sat in their semicircle, robed in white with purple stripes that marked their rank, faces carved into masks of polite deference. Yet Varro knew that behind those carefully schooled expressions lay ambition, resentment, and fear, and perhaps the hand that would one day drive a blade into his back. He had summoned them under the guise of discussing new grain tariffs for the provinces. But in truth, this meeting was a test, a chance to watch them squirm under his gaze and betray themselves with a flicker of the eye or a tremor in the voice. For Rome was not merely ruled by the sword, but by the art of reading men's souls. Senator Cassianus, tall and thin as a pike, rose first, his speech smooth as olive oil, as he praised the emperor. Wisdom, while slyly questioning the necessity of maintaining so many legions in the eastern provinces. A subtle jab at Varro, military expenditures that could be interpreted as fiscal prudence or as an attempt to weaken the emperor's military grip. Varro let the man speak, offering only a faint, unreadable smile, while his mind noted every word, every inflection, filing it away like an accountant tallying debts. Then came Senator Flavius, whose family had long been rivals to the house of Varro, and his oration was a masterstroke of double-edged flattery, lauding the emperor's victories while lamenting the hardships placed upon Roman merchants by constant campaigns abroad, a speech crafted to stir discontent among the city's wealthy traders without openly defying imperial policy. The chamber murmured at his words, some nodding, others glancing nervously toward the throne. And Varro, keeping his face a mask of calm authority, felt the slow burn of anger in his chest, for he knew. These men thought themselves clever enough to chip away at his authority in public without risking his wrath. But Lucius Varro had been raised in the crucible of Roman politics, tutored by men who believed survival depended upon anticipating betrayal before the dagger was drawn, and so, when the senators had finished their posturing, he rose, the folds of his purple-trimmed toga cascading like the wings of a great eagle, and in a voice that carried to the farthest recesses of the hall, he announced that, in light of recent security concerns, he would be appointing a special committee of 3 senators to oversee the distribution of grain and the management of provincial taxes. A move that seemed administrative in nature, but in truth would strip several of his rivals of their financial influence, while granting him a trio of loyalists, the eyes and ears in every corner of the empire. A ripple of unease passed through the assembly, for they understood the implications, yet none dared voice protest in the moment, and the emperor, satisfied that his gambit had landed, called for the meeting to adjourn, the echo of his footsteps upon the marble floor ringing like the toll of a bell. But as he departed through the side corridor reserved for the princeps, a shadow detached itself from the colonnade. An old friend, Tribune Aurelius, who leaned in close and murmured, "Be wary, Lucius. Tonight I heard the words Ides of March, spoken not in jest." And though the warning sent a chill through his veins, the emperor merely clasped Aurelius by the arm and replied, "Let them plan their games, old friend. I have pieces of my own to move, for in the deadly politics of Rome, survival belonged to those who struck first and hardest." And Lucius Varro had no intention of becoming another name carved upon the blood-stained stones of the Forum. The year was AD 476, and though the Senate still convened, and though the streets of Rome still echoed with the shuffle of sandals, the empire was no longer what it had been in the days of Augustus, Trajan, or even the most recent years of hard-fought glory under Emperor Titus Aurelius Maximus. The legions that had once marched in unbroken lines across the world's horizons were now scattered, their banners tattered, their loyalty tested by the lure of gold from barbarian kings. The emperor, once the master of the world, now ruled more in name than in truth. And in the Forum, marble statues stood pocked and worn, as if the very gods had turned their gaze elsewhere. Yet among the ruins of power, Titus Aurelius Maximus still carried the torch of Rome in his heart, refusing to let the eternal city's flame die without one final blaze of glory. His hair was now white, his face lined with the deep trenches of decades spent in war and politics, but his eyes retained the sharp gleam of a soldier who had never accepted defeat. Messengers arrived daily with grim news, the Visigoths pushing from the north, the Vandals threatening the coasts, the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople sending polite but empty promises of aid. In the dim halls of the imperial palace, advisors whispered that it would be better to negotiate a surrender, to keep the title of emperor as a ceremonial relic under barbarian oversight. But Titus was not made for surrender. He had been born in a time when Rome still believed itself the rightful ruler of the known world, and he would die believing it. On the morning of his final council, he stood before the Senate, his voice strong despite his years, declaring that the honor of Rome was not for sale, not for barter, and not for bending under the boots of men who once trembled at the sight of a single Roman cohort. The senators, robed in faded togas that still clung to old traditions, rose to their feet not because they believed victory was possible, but because they could not deny the dignity in the old man's defiance. That night, as torches flickered along the walls of the city, Titus gathered what remained of the legions, barely 3,000 men. Veterans mixed with boys who had never seen battle, and rode to the north gate. His armor was polished as if he were marching to meet Caesar himself, and the eagle's standard was carried ahead, its golden wings catching the moonlight. Outside the gate, the barbarian warlord Odoacer waited with an army that dwarfed the Romans in number and strength. He offered terms: spare the city, hand over the crown, live out the rest of his days in quiet exile. Titus dismounted, looked Odoacer in the eye, and spoke words that would be repeated in hushed tones for centuries. Rome does not ask for peace. Rome makes peace where Rome dies. The battle that followed was as much a ritual as it was a fight. The Romans fought in tight formations, their shields locking together, their swords flashing in disciplined strikes, and though they felled hundreds of their foes, the tide was inevitable. One by one, the eagle banners fell, and the city gates shuddered under the force of barbarian rams. When at last Titus Aurelius Maximus fell, it was not to a sword but to the crush of enemy bodies, his armor dented, his hands still clenched around the hilt of his gladius. Odoacer, moved by the old man's valor, ordered his body carried into the city and laid in the Forum, where the people of Rome could see him one last time. The following day, the Senate convened, and under duress, offered the imperial regalia to the Eastern emperor, ending the line of Western Roman emperors. But the people who walked past Titus's bier that week did not see defeat. They saw the final embodiment of what Rome had been: courage against hopeless odds, pride in the face of ruin, and the refusal to kneel before the world. In the years that followed, poets would write of Titus Aurelius Maximus as the last light of the West, the man who met the end of the empire with sword in hand and the eternal city in his heart. And so, though the political Rome fell, the Rome of the spirit, the Rome of roads and laws, of honor and steel, lived on in the hearts of those who remembered him, carried across centuries by the tales of the old empire until even in faraway lands, across oceans the Romans never dreamed of, people would speak of a time when one man stood alone at the gates and dared the darkness to come.